Hello everyone, welcome to HFY Beyond Terror. This channel is all about HFY and sci-fi stories, where humanity's underestimated and then proves...
Captain Ishan Ro kept his eyes forward and his hands still, the way the Academy drilled into him until it lived in the muscles. The hull of Radiant Accord was not a room so much as a statement. Vaulted ribs of pale stone arched overhead like the inside of a colossal shell, and banners woven with metallic thread that caught the light hung in layered tiers from the highest galleries. Hundreds of Cathari courtiers filled the terraces in strict gradients of rank. Their faces were narrower than human, their eyes dark and reflective, and their ceremonial collars flared like stylized wings. Everything about their arrangement said order and memory. Even the silence felt curated. Ishan stood among Earths. Delegation as military liaison, one uniform among a careful selection of suits and diplomatic dress. The senior negotiators, Ambassador Hoffel and her team, occupied the front. Behind them, the security detail and military advisors formed the second line, visible enough to signal capability, distant enough to avoid looking like a threat. That was Ishan's job today. Be present. Be forgettable. At the center, dais sat Sovereign Vera, ruler of the Cathari Concord, elevated on a seat that looked grown rather than built. The throne's material resembled bone porcelain, shot through with veins of blue luminescence as if the chair itself carried a pulse. Ishan had read the briefings. Vera had taken the mantle 8 cycles ago after a career that had put her at the front of skirmish lines and crisis councils. The reports painted her as disciplined, pragmatic, and uncommonly strategic, a leader who didn't confuse ceremony for substance, but used ceremony like a blade. The formalities proceeded with a precision that made human protocol seem casual. Credentials were presented. Greetings were exchanged in 2 languages, then repeated a 3rd time for the court's record. The Cathari scribes' thin figures with ink-stained fingers scratched symbols into long scrolls of translucent film. Ishan stayed motionless, breathing shallowly. Professional invisibility. That's the point. Then the sovereign rose. Vera descended the steps with a grace that didn't waste a movement. She moved along the line of humans, pausing for exactly the length required by custom. A nod, an acknowledgement, a measured glance that catalogued each face as if placing it into a private archive. When she reached Ishan, she stopped. Not the brief halt of procedure, a real pause. Her eyes lifted to his face and stayed there, searching with a focus that tightened the air between them. Ishan felt his pulse try to break discipline. No, impossible. It had been 14, nearly 15 years since the Sable Line skirmishes. He had been younger, leaner, a junior officer with a field medkit and a head full of ideals that didn't fit neatly into orders. And she hadn't been a sovereign. She'd been a bleeding body in a crater. Captain, a Cathari aide announced. Softly, pronouncing the word with careful effort, Ishan Ru, liaison of Earth's armed forces. Vera's voice was quiet but carried, the kind of quiet that made everyone listen. Have we met, Captain Ro? The question struck him like cold water. He kept his posture perfect. Not formally, Sovereign. This is my first official contact. With the Concord. Technically true. Their previous contact had been neither official nor permitted. It had been the kind of moment that got filed away into sealed records, if it got recorded at all. Vera's gaze flicked down, just for an instant, to his forearm where the cuff of his uniform ended. There, a pale, jagged scar cut from wrist. Toward elbow, a relic of rock and ice and a day he'd tried not to remember too often. Her eyes returned to his face. For a breath, she looked almost uncertain. Then her expression reset into regal neutrality, and she moved on to the next member of the line as if nothing had happened. But the hall felt different after she passed. Him, as if her attention had left a wake. In the delegation quarters later, Colonel Serrano Earth Security Commander cornered Ishan near the corridor junction where the cameras didn't quite overlap. "The Sovereign stared at you," Serrano said, low and sharp. "Not a casual scan, a recognition stare. What is it?" Ishan weighed his answer the way he'd once weighed ammunition carefully, aware of consequences. "I served in the Sable. Line theater, sir. It's possible she saw me during those operations." Serrano's eyes narrowed. "Possible how?" "Battlefield overlap," Ishan said. "Chaos, smoke. I don't have a specific recollection." That was a lie by omission so practiced it barely felt like one. Serrano studied him, then gave a curt nod. "If you remember something, you tell me. Diplomatic dynamics are fragile. Personal history changes the math." "Yes, sir." That night, alone in his assigned suite, Ishan lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling's soft-lit panels until they blurred. The scar itched phantom sensation, memory masquerading as skin. He hadn't thought about the crater in months, about the way the wind had carried ash across the broken ground, about the Cathari officer's breath, thin and wet, bubbling at the edge of consciousness, about the order in his cum that had said, "Do not compromise recon objectives for non-tactical rescue operations." He'd broken that order, not for glory, not for strategy, because the idea of leaving someone to die someone young, terrified, and alone had felt like a kind of moral suffocation. Back then he'd told himself the moment would vanish into the noise of war. He'd assumed the universe forgot acts like that. But the Sovereign's eyes hadn't looked like forgetting. 15 years earlier, Ensign Ishan Rao had been leading a 5-person reconnaissance team across the jagged edge of contested space, skirting sensor nets and minefields in the gray zones where maps lied. The Sable Line wasn't a front so much as a series of scars across stars, disputed mining routes, broken treaties, and pride sharpened into bullets. The public had called it a resource conflict. The soldiers called it what it was, a grind of ambushes and retaliations that chewed up people without solving anything. That day, Ishan's team found the aftermath of a Cathari patrol strike. The ground was cratered. The air stank of burned polymer and ozone. Shattered equipment lay strewn like bones. His second, Merrick, had sworn under his breath, "We should mark and move." Extractions in 6 hours. Ishan had nodded until he saw movement. In a shallow blast crater, half covered by dust and torn fabric, a Cathari officer lay on her side. Her armor plate was cracked, and dark blood pooled beneath her in thick puddles. Burns marred her shoulder. Her breathing was a ragged whisper, like paper tearing. She was young. Not a child, but not old enough to wear that much certainty. Her rank insignia, 3 small facets embedded near the collar, marked her as command. "Track." Merrick's voice went flat. "Enemy officer. We take her as intel or we leave. We don't play medic." Ishan crouched anyway. The Cathari's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Fever glazed them. Her mouth moved around words he didn't understand. "We can't carry her," Merrick insisted. "It's dead weight. It compromises the team." Ishan pulled his medkit free with hands that had stopped shaking years before. "She's dying," he said. "That's not our problem." "It becomes our problem the moment we have the power to change it," Ishan replied, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. He sealed wounds as best he could, injected broad-spectrum antibiotics, stabilized her breathing. The Cathari officer drifted in and out, delirious. Once, her hand latched onto his wrist, claws not quite forming, and she murmured something that sounded like a name. He didn't answer. He didn't know it. When the kit was nearly empty and the team's patience nearly gone, Ishan made the second decision worse by regulation. "We're taking her to the neutral ridge," he said. Merrick stared as if he'd announced he planned to juggle grenades. "Sir, I'll carry, Ishan cut in. You cover. The march that followed burned itself into him in fragments. The weight of her body over his shoulder, heavier than it should have been. The way her breathing warmed the inside of his collar. The wet slip of blood through his glove when he adjusted his grip. They moved through ravines and broken shale. Twice they went to ground while drones passed overhead. Once, a burst of gunfire cracked somewhere distant and the team froze, listening for footsteps that never came. The scar on his forearm came from a misstep near the ridge his boot skidded on ice-slick stone, and his arm raked along a jagged outcrop as he caught himself, refusing to drop her. The pain had been sharp and bright, but he'd barely registered it beyond don't let go. Near the boundary line, they signaled into the gray with a beacon pulse that both sides had, by bitter agreement, learned to recognize wounded transfer. A Cathari response patrol arrived with weapons raised. Ishan eased the officer down, hands open to show he carried no threat. Their leader shouted in Cathari, then in broken trade speech. Identify. Ishan didn't. He just stepped back. Watched them lift her with careful urgency, and then turned and vanished into the rocks before they could decide whether to thank him or shoot him. His report later was clinical, humanitarian aid rendered under interspecies convention. His reprimand was not. Serrano, then a major, had slammed the file onto the table. You compromised mission integrity for sentiment. Ishan had met his eyes and said, I compromised nothing that matters. He'd taken the punishment. He'd kept the scar. And he'd never learned the Cathari officer's name. Now in the present, the second evening of negotiations brought a formal dinner. Uniforms were set aside for neutral ceremonial attire, nothing that screamed military, nothing that surrendered. Dignity. Ishan stood in a small dressing annex, tugging a cuff straight, when the door opened without warning. He turned. Sovereign Vera stood in the doorway alone. No guards. No aides. No announcement. For a heartbeat, the scene made no sense. Then her gaze dropped to his forearm where his sleeve sat slightly higher in this attire. The scar was visible. Vera crossed the room in 3 swift steps. Before he could move, her fingers touched the pale ridge of old tissue. She traced its jagged path as if reading it. Her breath hitched. It is you? Ishan's throat went dry. Sovereign, come, she said. Not loud, not dramatic. Absolute. It wasn't a request. It was a monarch's command wrapped in a voice that trembled just enough to betray a person beneath the crown. She led him through a narrow passage into a private chamber draped in sound-dampening fabric. The door sealed behind them with a soft click. For the first time since entering the palace, Ishan felt the absence of watching eyes. Vera faced him, hands clasped tightly as if she feared they might shake. I did not recognize you in the hall, she said. Years reshape faces. Titles reorder context. But that scar, her eyes flicked again to his arm. I stared at it while you carried me. It was the only thing stable in a world of pain. Ishan's breath came slow. You remember. I remember fragments, Vera said. A voice. Telling me to stay. Hands pressing cloth to my wounds. The scent of antiseptic wrong for a battlefield, impossible, and yet there. I remember waking 3 days later in a Concord infirmary and asking who brought me in. She swallowed. Motion small but human in its vulnerability. They told me an unknown human soldier had delivered me to neutral ground, then vanished. Ishan searched for words that did not sound like excuses. I didn't expect to see you again. I didn't know who you were. I was not who I am, Vera agreed. Then I was Vera of the 3rd Legion, a commander shaped by doctrine. We were taught that mercy is a leak in the hull, that compassion is a luxury that sinks fleets. She walked to the chamber window and stared out. At the city beyond spires lit like constellations brought to ground. When my unit broke and left me, I believed death was the natural conclusion, not tragic, not unfair, simply accounted for. Her voice hardened, then softened again. And then an enemy found me and refused to let me die. Ishun's jaw tightened. Your unit left because retrieval was unsafe. I know, Vera said, turning back. Their decision was tactical. Yours was not. That is why it mattered. She stepped closer, gaze bright with something he couldn't name. Do you understand what you did to me? She asked. I saved your life, he said carefully. Vera shook her head once. You did more. You broke a story I had lived inside since childhood. You made me see that an enemy can be a person before they are a target. That realization lodged in me like a shard. She touched his forearm again, gentler this time. When I rose in rank, I questioned orders that demanded cruelty for efficiency. When I was offered the mantle, I accepted it believing the Concord could be strong without being blind. I built policy on restraint. I sought negotiation before retaliation. Her eyes held his. Not because it was easy, because you made it possible. Ishun felt something shift in his chest, a pressure he hadn't expected. I didn't do it for that, he said. I did it because leaving you there felt wrong. That was all. Vera's mouth curved slightly, a sad, grateful shape. Yes. And that is why the debt binds, he frowned. Debt? In our culture, Vera said, there is the sun bond. When someone preserves your life at clear risk to their own without seeking gain, you are bound by honor. The bond is not transactional. It is a recognition that your continued existence is entangled with another's choice. Her voice dropped. For 15 years I have carried a sun bond to a nameless human. I thought I would never fulfill it. I thought the universe had stolen my chance to say thank you. She looked at him as if the room might dissolve. And then your people arrived at my palace with banners and polite words and treaties, and there you were standing behind. The negotiators like you were nobody at all. Ishun let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Sovereign, I don't want. I know what you want, Vera interrupted, but there was no sharpness in it. You want nothing. That is also why it binds. The next morning, the hall of radiant accord filled again Cathari nobility on their terraces, human delegates on the polished floor below, cameras and recorders positioned like silent witnesses. Ambassador Hoffel stood poised, ready to begin another round of careful language. Then Sovereign Vera rose and every sound died. I must speak of a matter that predates today's negotiations, she said, voice amplified by the hall's acoustics. A matter that reaches into the foundations of honor. She gestured, and an attendant brought forward a ceremonial staff, an old symbol of witness, used when truth was to be recorded without distortion. 15 years ago, Vera continued, during what your historians call the Sable Line skirmishes, I was a field commander. My unit was struck. I was wounded and left behind. I expected to die on contested ground. The hall held its breath. Instead, she said, an enemy soldier human found me. He treated my injuries. He carried me through dangerous terrain to neutral boundary. He delivered me to Concord Patrol and vanished without name or claim. Murmurs rippled through the terraces. On the human side, diplomats exchanged fast, startled looks. Vera's gaze swept across them until it found Ishun. He stood rigid, suddenly too visible. That soldier, the sovereign said, was Captain Ishun Rao, now liaison within Earth's delegation. A low wave of shock ran through the humans like wind through grass. Colonel Serrano's head snapped toward Ishun. Ambassador Hoffel blinked hard, then recovered with diplomatic instinct. Captain Rao, Hoffel said aloud, careful and controlled. Is this accurate? Ishun's mouth felt full of sand. He forced his voice to steady. Yes, Ambassador. During the skirmishes, I encountered a wounded Cathari officer and provided aid. You never reported that the officer was. Hoffel stopped herself, glancing at Vera. You never knew. I did not, Ishan said. I never learned. Her identity. Vera lifted the staff slightly, and the gesture silenced the murmurs again. In the Concord, she said, a sun bond extends beyond individuals. The act that saved me was performed by a human without expectation of reward. Such mercy is not forgotten. It binds hearts. It shapes the way we choose to see each other. Her eyes gleamed like polished obsidian. Therefore, I declare before court and council that the sun bond between myself and Captain Rao will be honored openly. And because he stands here as part of Earth's mission, the bond becomes by cultural law an obligation of good faith between our peoples. On the terraces, some nobles stiffened, clearly uneasy. On the human floor, Ambassador Hoffel's expression shifted, calculation adjusting to opportunity. Serrano's stare bored into the side of Ishan's head like a laser. Vera continued, her voice steady now, no tremor left. Let it be recorded. The Concord will approach these negotiations with sincerity and restraint, recognizing that even in war, humanity demonstrated compassion worthy of respect. The scribes wrote faster. The hall's atmosphere changed, as if a heavy door had swung open and sunlight poured in, warm, dangerous, revealing. Not because treaties had been signed, because a story had been shared, and stories were the oldest form of power. Later, in a quiet corridor lined with carved stone leaves, Vera met Ishan again without audience. This time she brought 2 guards, who stayed at a respectful distance, as if even they understood the delicacy of what had happened. I have complicated your life, she said, sounding almost apologetic. You've rewritten it, Ishan replied, still dazed by how quickly. Everything had shifted. Vera studied him. Do you regret it? That day? He didn't need to think. No. Even though it brought you reprimand? Yes. Even knowing it might now entangle you in diplomacy you never wanted? He hesitated, then shook his head. I did what I could with what I had. If the consequences echo, that doesn't change the choice. Vera's shoulders eased, a fraction of weightlifting. That answer is consistent, she said, and there was the hint of that earlier smile again. It is comforting. Ishan glanced toward the distant hall where ambassadors and ministers waited to leverage the new reality. What happens? Now, Vera said. We build something that proves your mercy was not an anomaly. We show our people that compassion can survive contact with fear. She turned her hand palm up in a gesture that was not quite a handshake, not quite a salute, something in between. A bridging symbol. I owe you, she said simply, not as currency, as honor. And I will use that honor to steer this meeting. Away from the old patterns. Ishan looked at her hand. For a second, he saw again the crater, the blood, the delirious eyes. Then he saw the sovereign, carrying the weight of an empire and still making room for gratitude. He placed his hand lightly against hers, not grasping, not claiming, just acknowledging. I'm glad you lived, he said. Vera's voice softened. So am I, and I am glad you did not become the kind of soldier who can step over a dying stranger. She drew her hand back, composure returning, but her eyes remained humanly bright. Remember this, Captain Rao. The moments that shape history are not always the ones planned by councils. Sometimes they are a single decision made. In the dirt when no one is watching. Ishan let out a slow breath. I didn't think anyone would remember. Vera's gaze held his. Compassion leaves marks, she said, and her eyes flicked once more to his scar. Not all of them are wounds. As she walked away toward the waiting corridors of state, Ishan stood for a beat longer, feeling the strange truth settle. that in a universe of fleets and flags and treaties, an act of simple mercy could outlast wars, outlast careers, outlast the stories people told about enemies. And sometimes years. Later, it could return not to demand payment, but to remind the world what it could be.